Hello and welcome to the latest edition of our Top Tips for SME series with me, Philip King, and Blue Chain. I'm delighted to be joined by Robert Brooker, who is Head of Fraud and Forensics at PKF GM. Robert, please can you introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and then talk us through your 3 top tips.
Thank you, Philip, very much, and thank you to Blue Chain for having me. It's an absolute privilege to be here. So, who am I? Robert Brooker, Head of Fraud and Forensics at PKF GM, a top 10 accountancy practice. I've been here 6 years and previously was Head of Fraud at Transport for London for a number of years. And what do we do as a consultancy of fraud and forensics? We're a team of forensic accountants and forensic investigators working closely with contentious insolvency team, whereby companies that have become insolvent, unfortunately on many occasions is due to fraud. We will look at the fraud element of it and take that from the fraud element and from the investigation right the way through to prosecution, disciplinary, and the recovery of the loss. We additionally work for private and public sector, whether it be as a forensic accountant piece or as an investigations team, looking to identify fraud, bribery, corruption, etc. My 3 top tips. Number 1, identify your fraud risks and mitigate and manage them. The reason being is that these are really quite generic. Many people will ask you to look at tools that might cost you money, but actually what can you do yourselves that doesn't necessarily cost you money is identify your risks. If you know where your risks are, you've got a chance of mitigating against them and then manage that on an ongoing process. Tip number 2, awareness and education. And this is around you, not just you as the MD or as the CEO, but you as an organization. What is fraud? Do your staff, do your customers, do your suppliers know exactly what fraud is? Do they know how to mitigate against it? Do they know how to report it if they find it? It's about educating people to understand what that looks like. And tip number 3 is onboarding and undertaking due diligence when you onboard customers, suppliers, or staff. Because all of this contributes to creating a counter-fraud culture with the tone coming from the top, not just from the chief exec, but also from the NED, the non-exec directors, and your executive board, which encourages the correct behaviours and consequences for those that sadly don't abide by them.
I'm delighted we're now being joined by Tim Ellis, who is CEO of Blue Chain, as we take a more thorough look at Robert's 3 tips. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Philip.
Robert, your first tip was to identify the fraud risks, mitigate against them, and manage them. What should small business owners be looking out for?
Thank you, Philip, very much indeed. And the idea of that is identifying your fraud risks. It really depends on what business you're in. Do you actually take payments? Do you have any financial control? Do you actually provide a service or a good? So it's identifying where people could potentially commit fraud against you. Now, that may be externally with third parties, that may be internally with your own employees, or indeed contractors or suppliers. It's getting an understanding of what do your fraud risks look like. Have you ever actually tried to analyse where you are at risk of fraud? So one of the common areas, Philip, is AP fraud, accounts payable fraud. Now, the majority of us would have an accounts payable team or an accounts payable individual. How much autonomy do we give to those people? Is there a chain of command in there with an approval process? And actually, what is the risk? I deal with many cases, and sadly, you've worked for the business for a number of years. You're the finance director. You're even a director of the company. You've known these guys since DOT. You've been schoolmates, whatever. And unfortunately, your circumstances change. And during that process, that person has got complete autonomy, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and before you know it, they're transferring money to their own accounts. So it's just, I know that's really sounds simple, but sadly, we take it for granted, is identifying where those risks may lie.
Yeah, and we've all seen recent press reports. I think it was a school somewhere in the northwest where a office manager was fleecing thousands out of the school. And I guess it is worse when it's someone you've known and trusted, and you just hand the keys over to them and assume they're trustworthy. And that's clearly one of the main risks, because when someone's new, you watch them, but when they've been there for a while, you become complacent. Tim, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've worked in payments for the last 20 years. There's lots of horror stories and learning stories and interesting stories, right, around fraud in payments. And we're talking about people who are maliciously within your business taking advantage of responsibility you've given them. But there's lots of scenarios where their intention is not malicious. It's perhaps a lack of process. It's perhaps a lack of diligence that can cause the problem. I've heard of many scenarios where businesses have had an invoice come in that someone hasn't checked. Someone's changed the bank details. Oh, we changed our bank details. Can you pay to this account now? Yeah, fine, no worries. And then obviously that's a fraudster who's making that payment, things like that. So, I think there is both, what are the malicious threats that could happen? Where are the points where failure could happen because you've given responsibility? But where are the points where you need to be diligent? Who are those bank details? Have they changed? All of that, I think, is also really important to bear in mind, because there's nothing worse than paying money out to someone and it going to the wrong place. That's devastating for us.
Totally agree with you, Tim. Bank diversion fraud, stroke mandate fraud, sadly, is still top of the list and one of the highest frauds that occurs. And you're quite right. I'm old enough to remember when this was done in the form of a letter, and all they did was copy the company heading. Following that, we've moved on to email, and people email it. We're now in the social engineering stage where people are making phone calls to accounts payable, building up a rapport to ensure that they end up, yeah, that's okay. I know they were changing bank details. That's all fine. That's where we then mitigate against these risks, because ultimately what happens here is you haven't got a process. People don't know what to do when a change of bank account details letter or email is received. If you don't know what to do, then sadly, what's going to happen is you'll pay anybody. And you're quite right, because what happens is I've changed the bank account details. That account and those details don't belong to the company that you're working with. They belong to the fraudsters. Then what happens is the company you're working with contacts you after 3 or 4 weeks to say, we've not been paid invoice 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, we have. We paid this on that date. Didn't come to me. And sadly, those accounts are set up specifically for fraud. So the minute the money hits that account, it's completely diverted to other accounts throughout the world that here in the UK, we have very little or no jurisdiction over, and you've lost that money. Really, really sad, and you're quite right.
Thanks, Robert. So what I'm hearing is that whether you're a large business or a sole trader, you need a process for this stuff. That if someone says the bank details have changed, go and check with the customer before you pay somebody else. And having a process, however simple it is, just puts a step between something happening and stopping it if you need to. UK Finance reported there was £1.2 billion of fraud losses in 2022. That's a staggering number. And when I'm a small business commissioner, I talk to loads of small businesses that had lost, for them, a massive figure, 5,000-10,000, that was, their turnover for 2 or 3 months through a push payment fraud or something similar. And I guess the old adage is it'll never happen to me. It doesn't until it does. And of course, then you're really caught. Businesses need to take steps to identify where it's likely to happen. But, Tim, I know you've got some stuff around this, haven't you? You talk about how we can find this linkage to payments and payment details and so on.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff, the more you dig into that 1.2 billion, you understand where it's coming from. And one of the areas that has been growing significantly, particularly over COVID and since COVID, has been the pay by link fraud, where you're sent a link from what you believe is a trusted source. You click on that link to pay the bill. They've said, it's British Gas. There's 2 S's, but you haven't noticed that. You click on the link and it takes you to a payment page where you pay your bill. Unfortunately, you're not paying British Gas, you're paying a fraudster of some kind. And the next one, or the previous one perhaps, was from a trusted source and it was absolutely fine. But it's, the 1 in 3 that you now assume that clicking on that link is an okay thing to do. That's the problem that's created by these payment links. And I've heard of businesses where, not just via payment link, but at various scenarios, like you say, Philip, they've lost a month's revenue, they've lost a year's turnover, right, by paying a bill that has gone to a fraudster and it's been unrecovered for the reasons that Robert was saying. So I think it's really critical that we are aware of it and we don't just click links. Get a link, maybe just phone your supplier and say, hey, I just got a link from you. Is that normal? Also read the link, see what it says, because if it doesn't say the company name in the right spelling, or it doesn't even say the company name, you should probably be checking that as a minimum. And one of the things that, Pay.uk, who's one of the regulatory bodies for the UK, has been pushing out is request to pay, where you have a verified source on the other end. You don't receive links, you receive a request. And that is something that's propagating. Bluechain is part of that journey into the market. And it gives you a secure channel between you and your customer, you and your supplier, to pay your bills. So it's worth investigating some of those tools as well, which can protect you from these types of scenarios. I think the one thing, sorry to keep talking, the one thing is both for your employees and for yourself, it should never be a problem that you're checking, you're making sure you're safe. So if an employee takes some time doing something because they decided to phone the supplier or the customer to make sure that they were doing the right thing, that's a good thing, right? Might have taken a bit longer, but it's a good thing. If you say to your supplier or your customer, you need to do it this way because I'm not comfortable that I've got the right details, so I need to be comfortable before I'm going to pay you or receive funds, that's a good thing, right? Everyone is looking after each other. We shouldn't get angry or annoyed with people who are taking an extra step to be safe. We wouldn't crossing the road, right? Just run across the road, it'll be fine. No, look both ways. There's cars on the road, right? It's the same type of thing.
Yeah. And I guess
just two little tips there. Sorry, Philip, if I may. Two little tips back to Tim's point. One is right-click on the email address, because that will tell you who it's really from. So whether it is really from tim.annis@bluechain.com, whatever, or whether that's actually from abcdefg@gmail.com. The second is, please do not respond to any details within that initial email with the link in it. Please go back to your original paperwork, your original conversations with your supplier or with the person that you're engaged with, and take the details from there. All too often, we take the details from the email, and sure enough, the fraudster's at the other end of the phone. Totally agree, Tim. Great advice, great help for people. Get a process in place. Agree that process, which has to be taking that information, always making a phone call. And then ultimately you've got a chance. Listen, your small, medium enterprises, your small businesses, it's really easy to overlook these kind of things. But for the sake of taking a minute, please do so. Build it into your rapport with your supply chain. Have that conversation. They won't object at all. We all understand it. And in fact, the new Economic Crime and Transparency Bill is looking at this entirely. It's about slowing down the process of fast payments technology and trying to make us all, to quote UK Finance, take five and just take a step back and think.
Yeah, never act in haste and just do something quickly because it's
exactly
you can pay the price. So you talked about awareness and education, Robert, in your tips. Whose responsibility is that? We see lots of talk about, the banks have to be responsible for all this push payment fraud and all of that stuff. But where does the ownership sit, or where should it sit?
Let's go back to the very beginning of our conversation, Philip, and we talked about these. There are many things out there to help you prevent against fraud. What we're looking at is things you can do yourselves to help you prevent against fraud. So me personally, I say it to you as an organization, not just you because you're the chief exec or the managing director, but you and your staff, and as we've just alluded to, include within that your customers and your supply chain. You take responsibility, you lead by example, you create that culture, then actually everybody else will follow suit. Don't be relying on others, as you just said, Philip, quite rightly. We've all seen in the press over the weekend that Revolut, as an example, may well lose their UK banking license. Now, because the reason being, it's rumoured, or it's been purported in the press over the weekend, over 70% of those accounts are being used for fraudulent activity. So you can't rely on others. Please take it upon yourselves to educate your staff, educate your supply chain, and therefore you then take that responsibility overall. Exactly as Tim just discussed, that's you taking responsibility, because then I believe you can help prevent it. If you're relying on others, then I'm sad to say you're almost going in the deep end without armbands.
Okay, that's great. You talked about onboarding of customers and suppliers and staff and so on. Can you give us a couple of specific actions a small business owner might take when they're bringing on a new supplier, let's say, or a new member of staff?
Yeah, of course. Let's start with staff first. How many of us in the smaller world, I've seen it happen in the big corporate world, so I know it happens. And sadly, once again, do you have the people, the time? How many people get a CV, take it as read? How many of us actually check that the person's undertaken the job they say they do to the level that they say they have the professional qualification that they say they have, and that they have everything else that goes with it to prove that they really are who they say they are, i.e. they have the right to work in the UK, they have done the job for the last 5-10 years at where they say they have, and that they are, for instance, a qualified chartered accountant. Pretty easy stuff to check and make sure that you've got that right person at the beginning. Listen, we all see in the press day in, day out, many people are doing this to large organizations. So please don't feel like it's a headache. It's just something else that you can do to try and help yourselves. With regards to a supplier, how many of us check who the supplier are? How many of us have a quick Google? How many of us look on Companies House to make sure they are who they say they are? There's not a shell company behind that company, and they're just set up to create fraud. What do we know about them? Who have they interacted with previously? Who do they work with already? Can we go and contact those people to make sure they are who they say they are? A, the individuals, B, the company, and they do what it says on the tin, so to speak. Without it, unfortunately, we really are struggling. But the minute we do that, we can gain some assurance as a small, medium enterprise, regardless of what size, that you are dealing with the right people, whether that be a staff employee, whether that be a customer, or indeed whether that be your supplier.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of that. I think it's incredible that there's not really that much work, but it will make you so much safer. And I think it's very easy to go, I'm just randomly picking businesses out of my head, but a plumber, or I just work in a bookshop, or I don't know, anything like, or I've got an e-commerce site, which you probably feel a bit more vulnerable, and so I'm not going to be at risk because I don't do something that puts me at risk. Yes, you will, because you pay money or you receive money, and that is the only criteria, basically, because often these sort of frauds are tackled by hitting at scale. Let's get 20 people doing $3,000 rather than try and get 500,000 from one single company, because 500,000 usually will have checks and balances against it. So we're always at risk. Doesn't mean it should be scaremongering. It should just be reflecting on, there's a chance that something go wrong. Just like there's a chance that your job, if you're a builder, could get rained off. And so you have to find ways to manage that, right? It's the same type of principle of how do you plan out to solve for these things that you can't control, but can impact you from outside. So I just echo all of that. And I think it probably one of the things, Robert, and perhaps you could allude to this towards the end, is where can we go to get some advice on this and some best practice and some ideas around some of these things? Is there any resources out there that you could perhaps recommend to us either now or in the post we'll do for this?
Of course. And I think just back to your point there, Tim, there's an old adage and saying of why would I take £1 million off of one person when I can steal £1 off of 1 million people? Yeah. Just think about that. It's the same amount of money, but unfortunately, nobody has anything in place to prevent the pound. We all have, as you alluded to, everything in control, a controls framework to prevent the £1 million being lost out the door. But why do I need to go big? I don't. I'll just take £1 off of everybody else. Yeah. And that's the small, medium enterprise world. And look, you're small until it goes wrong, and then you're significant because somebody along that chain is unfortunately relying on you. And this is my whole point around this new legislation that's come out. And I've been speaking with various people. Philip, I'm sure you won't mind. I've been speaking to Liz Barkley in some detail around this too, the current small business commissioner, is that ultimately the small but insignificant small, medium enterprises, the fraudsters will be driven through the failure to prevent to the small, medium enterprises. And you are probably providing a service to a large government department or a large corporate. When they can't deliver because they don't have the capacity, because you haven't done what you have to, because you've been the victims of fraud, then you will be known as not just a small, medium enterprise. You play a massive role in that food chain the whole way through the supply. And all I'm asking and all we're trying to do here is help you from becoming that person, because unfortunately nobody will want to know until it goes wrong, as we've already alluded to.
So where do we go for advice? Is it Action Fraud or what's the organisation that we should look to?
Look, I know, and I'm not silly, I've worked in this for 25 years now, and I'm a fraudie through and through, okay? And ultimately, Action Fraud's had a lot of bad press, okay? I'm not saying it's not deserved, but they've had a lot of bad press. But ultimately, there's a reason for that. It's fraud now, as Tim alluded to with the UK finance figures earlier. Fraud is a tsunami of it here in the UK. And what's happening is, I always relate Action Fraud to the roads. When the Romans built the roads, they never ever guessed that there'd be the volume of traffic on it that there is now. Hence the reason we all complain about the potholes. Well, do you know what? When Action Fraud was first set up, whoever knew there'd be this absolute volume of fraud that we're facing now? So unfortunately, it's not always the best response. The positives of that are Action Fraud is being revamped. It will be a new system from next year. And it should be a great way for you all to be able to report and then get responses in a far better manner. But at the moment, it's still the envy of the world because it's a reporting tool. Nobody will deal with you directly, whether it be policing or anybody else. Action Fraud is the place to go. Obviously, there are others to go to, and that may be your regulator if you work in the regulated sector and you're that way. It may be that there is just other trade bodies that you can go to. But ultimately, please report to Action Fraud, because if you do have fraud or cyber insurance, they will always be looking for your number that you've reported it to, because without it, you won't even be able to claim on your insurance. So yes, please, Action Fraud all the time. Failing that, obviously, I'm going to flag my own here. That's exactly what we do, and we'd include doing that for you. But ultimately, please make sure you report it. Don't let it go unreported, because the more goes unreported, as we just described, it may seem insignificant to you, but you're one of hundreds of thousands of people that have become victims. And that is when Action Fraud really does kick into its best.
Thanks, Robert. We're out of time, I'm afraid, now. But in summary, you said identify the risks and mitigate against them. Make sure there's awareness in your head and in the organisation, and make sure when you onboard customers and staff and so on, you do adequate due diligence. I guess many people watching this will have thought, well, this is all common sense. I know all this stuff. Well, yes, we do, but we forget about it until it hits us, and suddenly we realise we've realised too late. So I want to thank Robert again for his time today. Thank Tim for his contribution. And we've had some really good practical advice. Don't forget it. Make sure you're fully aware of the risks you face and mitigate against them. Don't forget to keep an eye out for future videos in this series at bluechain.com. Thank you both.
The thanks are all mine. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Tim.